The sky did not change. The solar system remained unchanged. There was no sudden flash, no dramatic tear in reality that people on Earth could point to orbital paths. It happened quietly, that quiet surface, far beyond the range of human sight. At the outer edge of the solar system where the darkness was deep, because now there was a record older than memory, not of contact. Then the Veltari fleet arrived, and records like that never stayed isolated travel in perfect sequence. 300 warships slipping back into expectations across systems that had not yet inevitability of something that had done this countless times before. Between stars, their hulls were attention began to drift in new absorbing starlight instead of reflecting it, not turning each ship into a moving absence against the scattered the universe did not stop moving. They did not scatter, neither did what moved. They did not hesitate. They formed a tight, deliberate formation, the kind used by a predator that already knows the outcome of the hunt. Engines stabilized. Weapons systems warmed. Sensor arrays unfolded like the slow opening of eyes. They began to look. The outer planets were scanned first. Gas giants mapped in seconds. Asteroid belts analyzed down to individual rock clusters. Comets tracked and dismissed. Nothing there posed a threat. Nothing there ever did. The sensors moved inward. And then they found it. A small, warm planet orbiting an average yellow star. It showed all the expected signs of a young civilization. Radio signals leaked into space in every direction, chaotic and unfiltered. Artificial satellites circled in uneven patterns. There were structures in low orbit, primitive, functional, fragile. There was no fleet, no defensive perimeter. No visible weapons capable of threatening even a single Veltari scout ship. On the flagship, Grand Admiral Velaroth stood in silence, looking at the distant blue point displayed across the observation screen. He had seen this before. Not once or twice, but dozens of times. 17 civilizations had faced him. 17 had ended the same way. Some had tried to communicate. Some had tried to hide. A few had attempted to fight. None had mattered. For 11,000 years, the Veltari Dominion had expanded across the outer spiral arm without interruption. There had never been an opponent capable of stopping them. There had rarely even been one capable of slowing them down. And there was nothing about this system, nothing at all, that suggested it would be any different. Begin standard procedure, Velaroth said. The order moved through the command structure instantly. Communication arrays aligned with the inner system. Signal translators activated, pulling from the massive archive of intercepted human broadcasts that had been collected long before the fleet ever arrived. Within seconds, the message was ready. It was broadcast across every known frequency, encoded in every major human language, structured in the same format that had been used for thousands of years. It did not need to change. It had never needed to change. The message was simple. Surrender all planetary and biological resources. Submit to cataloging and extraction procedures. Evacuate the surface within 40 rotations. Failure to comply would result in a demonstration of force. There was no threat in the tone. No anger. No urgency. The Dominion did not threaten. It informed. The transmissions spread across the solar system, reaching Earth in moments, slipping into satellites, ground stations, military networks, civilian channels. And then the Veltari fleet waited. They were very good at waiting. They had learned patience over millennia of uninterrupted victory. There was no need to rush the inevitable. Civilizations often took time to understand what was happening. Confusion, fear, denial, these things followed predictable patterns. Soon enough, the responses would come. Panic. Negotiation attempts. Fragmented communication between planetary governments trying to decide how to react. It always unfolded the same way. On the flagship, Velaroth remained at the observation screen, hands clasped behind his back, watching the small blue world that would, in a matter of time, become another entry in the Dominion's long record of acquisitions. He did not feel anticipation. He did not feel doubt. There was only routine. Around him, officers moved with quiet efficiency, monitoring data streams, confirming system stability, tracking the steady flow of information coming in from their scans. Everything was normal. Everything was under control. Far below, on Earth, the message was being received, translated, processed. Across continents, screens lit up with the same words. Across governments, emergency protocols activated. Across populations, confusion began to spread. But at the edge of the solar system, 300 warships held their position in perfect silence, their weapons ready, their sensors watching, their expectations unchanged. Because in 11,000 years, nothing like this had ever gone wrong. And there was no reason, none at all, to believe it would start now. The response did not come from a place anyone expected. It did not originate from a major government hub or a fortified command bunker buried beneath layers of reinforced earth. It did not come from a global coalition center filled with generals and advisors speaking over one another in rising urgency. It came from a quiet vessel in orbit, sitting in the shadow of the moon. On board, the lighting was soft, the system steady, the atmosphere almost ordinary. Consoles hummed. Data scrolled. No alarms were sounding. A man named Cal Donahue read the incoming transmission once. Then he read it again. He did not rush. He did not react outwardly in any dramatic way. His expression remained neutral, the kind of stillness that comes from long hours and long habits. He picked up his coffee, took a slow drink, and set the cup back down beside the console. Across from him, Diane Harlow had already finished reading the same message. She watched him for a moment, measuring his silence, then asked, "Well?" Cal leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes still on the text. "I think," he said, "they've done this before." Diane gave a small nod. "A lot." There was no fear in her voice. No disbelief. Just observation. Cal reached forward and brought up the response interface. The system activated instantly, waiting. "For what it's worth," Diane added, "they sound very confident." Cal almost smiled. "So would we," he said. He began typing. There was no rush in the movement. No hesitation either. The message was short, direct, carefully worded, but without decoration. When he finished, he read it once, adjusted a single line, and then sent it. The transmission left the vessel and crossed the distance to the Veltari fleet in seconds. On the flagship, the incoming signal was flagged immediately. The translation systems processed it automatically, aligning the structure with known linguistic patterns. The message appeared on the main display. Velaroth read it. He did not move while he did. Then he read it again. There were only a few lines. It acknowledged receipt of the Dominion's ultimatum. It identified the sender as a representative authority of Earth. And it issued a response. "Turn around and leave this system. This is not a request." For a moment, nothing in the command room changed. The systems continued running. Data continued flowing. Officers remained at their stations. But something in the air shifted, subtle and difficult to define. Velaroth turned slightly toward his communications officer. "Translation accuracy," he said. The officer checked the alignment, ran a secondary verification, then a third. "It is correct," she confirmed. No ambiguity in phrasing. Velaroth looked back at the message. In 11,000 years, no civilization had ever responded to the Dominion's standard ultimatum with a counter-command. There had been pleas. There had been silence. There had been attempts at negotiation built on hope rather than leverage. But never this. Never a directive. Never a refusal stated as fact. He considered it for a moment longer, then spoke. "Deploy reconnaissance." There was no change in tone. No visible irritation. No escalation in posture. Just a decision. A drone was prepared and launched within seconds. It moved fast, small, efficient, nearly invisible against the background of space. Its sensor suite activated at full capacity, sweeping ahead of it as it accelerated toward the inner system. It transmitted continuously. Telemetry flowed back to the fleet in clean, precise streams. Spatial mapping. Radiation readings. Signal analysis. Everything appeared normal. For 4 minutes. Then the signal stopped. Not degraded. Not interrupted. Stopped. The data feed cut cleanly, without warning, without distortion. In the command room, several officers leaned slightly toward their displays, rechecking readings, verifying the loss. "Malfunction," one of them suggested. Velaroth did not answer immediately. "Deploy a second drone," he said. The next one launched within moments. It followed a slightly altered trajectory, running a different scan pattern, pushing its systems harder, widening its observational spread. It transmitted for 2 minutes. Then it disappeared. Same result. No warning. No detectable interference. Just absence. A third drone was sent. This one lasted less than a minute. On the far side of the moon, Diane Harlow watched the data on her screen without changing expression. 3, she said quietly. Cal nodded, eyes on his own display. The intercept logs were clean. Too clean. Each engagement had executed exactly as designed. No deviation, no excess. "Timing's holding," Diane added. "I see it." She glanced at him. "They'll keep trying." "Of course they will." On the Veltari flagship, a fourth drone was already being prepared. Velaroth stood in the same position, watching the incoming data from the previous launches, replaying the final moments of each feed. There was nothing obvious. No visible projectile. No energy spike. No anomaly in the surrounding space that their systems could isolate as a threat. Just loss. "Fourth drone ready," the operations officer reported. "Launch." It went out faster than the others, systems pushed to higher thresholds, scanning aggressively, adjusting in real time. It lasted even less. The signal vanished before a full data cycle could complete. Silence settled across the command room. Not confusion, yet, but something close to it. Velaroth remained still, eyes focused on the empty section of the display where the feed had been. For drones. For losses. No explanation. He did not speak for several seconds. Around him, officers began running deeper diagnostics, expanding scan ranges, comparing telemetry, searching for patterns that would explain what had happened. There were none. No consistent signature. No identifiable weapon system. Nothing that matched anything in the Dominion's extensive records. Far away, in the quiet orbit behind the moon, Diane leaned slightly toward Cal. "They're thinking now," she said. Cal picked up his coffee again, found it empty, and set it back down. "Good," he replied. He looked at the tactical display, where the Veltari fleet still held position at the edge of the system, unchanged in formation, unchanged in posture. 300 ships. Silent. Watching. "Do you want to let the next one through?" Diane asked. "Just a glimpse." Cal considered that. Only for a moment. "No," he said. "Not yet." Diane nodded once and returned her attention to the screen. Out in the dark, where nothing appeared to be there, something waited. The Veltari could not see it. They could not detect it. They could not even confirm that it existed. But 4 of their drones were gone. And for the first time since their arrival, the situation was no longer following a familiar pattern. What the Veltari fleet could not see was not an absence. It was design. Across the solar system, in places their sensors had already swept and dismissed, systems waited in perfect stillness. Cold. Silent. Indistinguishable from the background they were built to mimic. In the asteroid belt, shapes that looked like drifting rock held their positions with microscopic precision. Their surfaces matched the irregular geometry of natural debris. Their temperatures blended seamlessly with the surrounding void. They were not rocks. They were kinetic. Platforms. Their targeting systems tracked everything. Around the gas giants, arrays lay threaded through rings of ice and dust, powered down to levels so low they barely existed on any measurable scale. Their structures were thin, distributed, impossible to distinguish from the countless fragments that surrounded them. In the outer system, far beyond where the Veltari had focused their attention, vessels moved in long, silent arcs. Their hulls scattered incoming sensor beams into meaningless noise. Their heat signatures dissolved into the cold radiation of space. They did not transmit. They did not reveal themselves. They waited. All of it had been placed carefully. Not in response to the Veltari fleet. Long before it, 400 years earlier, something had entered the solar system uninvited. It had not expected resistance. It had not survived. The wreckage had been studied in pieces at first. Fragments recovered from orbit. Materials that did not behave the way human science said they should. Systems that required decades to even begin to understand. But the most important thing had not been the technology. It had been the data. Buried within damaged storage cores and partially corrupted logs, there had been references, patterns, records of other worlds. And one word that appeared again and again: Dominion. The meaning had not been difficult to piece together. Humanity had learned, slowly but completely, what the Dominion did to civilizations that were not ready. And so they had made a decision. Not loudly, not publicly, but completely. They would be ready. The preparation had not been easy. It had not been clean. Over the next 4 centuries, the world changed in ways that had nothing to do with what was coming. There were wars. Many of them. Conflicts that redrew borders, collapsed governments, reshaped alliances. Moments where the idea of long-term planning nearly disappeared under the weight of immediate survival. There were plagues. Diseases that spread faster than systems could respond, that forced entire populations into isolation, that tested the limits of coordination and trust. There were famines, economic collapses, environmental disasters. There were years when the future felt uncertain in ways that had nothing to do with anything beyond the atmosphere. And more than once, there were moments where a handful of decisions could have ended everything. Through all of it, the preparation continued. Quietly. Relentlessly. Programs changed names. Leadership shifted. Entire governments rose and fell. The work did not stop. Knowledge was passed down deliberately. Not as a warning meant to create fear, but as a problem to be solved. Each generation improved what the previous one had started. Better materials. Better modeling. Better understanding of what an enemy like the Dominion might do, and how to respond. Mistakes were recorded. Corrected. Built upon. By the time the Veltari fleet arrived at the edge of the solar system, what they encountered was not a young civilization taking its first steps into space. It was a civilization that had spent 400 years preparing for a specific kind of visitor, and had done so without ever needing to prove it. Back on the Veltari flagship, the atmosphere had changed. Not dramatically. Not in any way that could be measured by instruments. But the rhythm was different. The easy certainty that had filled the command room at the moment of arrival had thinned. In its place was something quieter. Tension. New scans were running continuously now. Broader sweeps. Deeper analysis. Every sensor pushed closer to its operational limits. The results did not match the expectation. There were no fleets hidden in orbit. No large-scale weapons platforms. No energy signatures consistent with advanced military systems. Everything appeared exactly as it had before. A young world. Unprotected. Unprepared. And yet 4 drones were gone. Report, Veleroth said. Officers delivered their findings one by one. No confirmed hostile contact. No detectable weapons discharge. No anomalies consistent across drone losses. Each statement was precise. Each one added nothing useful. Veleroth listened without interruption. Then he made a decision. Select a strike group. There was no hesitation this time. Uncertainty could be studied, but it could also be resolved. 40 ships were chosen. Not the full fleet. That was unnecessary. Just enough to demonstrate power. Just enough to force a response. Their orders were simple. Advance into the inner system. Select a populated area. Remove it. The formation broke from the main fleet with clean precision, engines flaring to life as the strike group accelerated inward. They crossed the orbit of Mars in tight formation, sensors sweeping constantly, weapons primed. Every system was active. Every possible detection method engaged. They found nothing. Space remained empty. Silent. Unremarkable. Then 12 ships disappeared. There was no warning. No incoming fire tracked by their systems. No energy spike. No visible impact. One moment the ships were present on every display. The next they were not. The data logs showed only a fraction of a second of distortion, something moving too fast to be properly recorded. Then absence. The remaining ships reacted instantly. Formation broke. Weapons fired in all directions, targeting systems searching for anything that could explain what had just happened. They hit nothing. There was nothing to hit. 6 more ships vanished seconds later. Different angle. Different vector. Same result. The strike group began to scatter. Orders shifted from engagement to survival. Engines burned at maximum output as the surviving ships turned back toward the main fleet. Signals flooded the command network. Alerts. Partial readings. Fragmented attempts to describe something none of their systems could define. Another wave hit as they retreated. 14 more ships were lost before they reached safe distance. 8 returned. Damaged. Incomplete. Alive. On the flagship, the reports came in broken pieces. Visual logs that showed nothing. Sensor data that made no sense. Crew accounts that contradicted each other, unified only by confusion. Velaroth listened to all of it. He did not interrupt. He did not react. 40 ships had been sent. 8 had come back. No confirmed enemy contact. No identified weapon system. No clear explanation. He sat in silence for a long moment after the last report ended. They are more advanced than we assessed, one of his sub-admirals said carefully. Velaroth shook his head once. No. The answer was immediate. Certain. We have seen their technology, he continued. In their broadcasts. In their orbital structures. In their materials. He looked at the tactical display. They are not advanced. The room remained still. Then how? The officer began. They prepared, Velaroth said. The words settled into the space between them. Not speculation. Not theory. Conclusion. Far away, in a quiet control center beneath a dark sky, Grace Tillman watched the engagement results scroll across her display. Numbers stabilized. Loss ratios calculated. System performance updated in real time. Beside her, Lou Farrant studied a column of data with focused intensity. Zone 3 lagged slightly, he said. Targeting correction needs recalibration. Grace glanced at him briefly. 40 ships went in, she said. 8 came out. I know, Lou replied. It could still be cleaner. She almost smiled. Then her attention returned to the larger display. 300 Veltari ships. Still at the edge of the system. Still intact. But no longer certain. They'll change approach, someone at another station said. They have to, Grace answered. She leaned back slightly, studying the formation. They're looking for something they can see. Lou nodded faintly. There's nothing to see. Exactly. Grace folded her hands on the desk. They've stopped following their script. Out in the dark, the Veltari fleet held position. 300 ships. Unmoving. Watching a system that looked harmless. That behaved impossibly. And for the first time in 11,000 years, they were no longer sure what would happen next. Uncertainty did not sit well with Grand Admiral Velaroth. For most of his career, uncertainty had been a temporary condition, something that existed only until better data arrived, until a clearer scan resolved the unknown into something measurable, predictable, controllable. This was different. This was not a lack of data. This was data that did not make sense. He stood in the command room, looking at a tactical display that still showed 300 Veltari warships holding perfect formation at the edge of a system that had just dismantled a strike group without ever revealing how. Status, he said. Fleet operational, an officer replied. All primary systems nominal. Enemy activity? No confirmed movement. No detectable weapons systems. No energy output beyond civilian thresholds. Everything appeared unchanged. That was the problem. Velaroth turned slightly, addressing the room without raising his voice. They want us to look for something that is not there. No one answered. Because it was true. Every scan they had run had been searching for visible power, ships, weapons, energy signatures, anything that could be measured and classified. But whatever had destroyed the strike group had not behaved like anything in their records. It had not announced itself. It had not lingered. It had acted and then disappeared back into nothing. They are controlling what we can observe, Velaroth continued. That thought settled heavily. Control of information was control of the battlefield. And at the moment, The Dominion did not have it. "Prepare for distributed engagement," he ordered. This time, there would be no concentrated strike group. No predictable formation. The fleet would move in segments, spreading across multiple vectors, probing the system from different angles simultaneously. If the enemy relied on fixed defenses, this would expose them. If the enemy relied on concealment, this would strain it. Orders moved quickly. Sections of the fleet began to reposition, breaking the perfect symmetry they had held since arrival. Engines ignited in controlled bursts, ships sliding into new trajectories, widening their operational spread. From a distance, it looked like motion. Inside the system, it changed nothing. In Montana, Grace Tillman watched the shift as it happened. "They're adapting," a technician said. "Of course they are," Grace replied. She leaned forward slightly, studying the new formations. Multiple vectors. Distributed scan patterns. "They're trying to force visibility." Lou glanced up from his console. "Won't work." "No," Grace said. "But it'll tell them something." "Like what?" She paused for a moment. "How little they're seeing." A quiet signal moved through the hidden network. Not loud. Not obvious. Just enough. Across the asteroid belt, several platforms adjusted their orientation by fractions of a degree. Targeting systems recalibrated, tracking the new vectors without changing their thermal profile. In the outer system, the stealth vessels altered course slightly, maintaining distance while tightening their observational coverage. Everything shifted. Nothing revealed itself. Back on the Veltari flagship, the new scan results began to come in. More data. More detail. More nothing. No matter where they looked, the system remained the same: cold rock, scattered debris, background radiation. No fleet. No weapons. No explanation. Velaroth studied the incoming reports in silence. Then something changed. Not in the data. In the interpretation. "They are not hiding from us," he said slowly. "They are hiding the fact that they are not hiding." Several officers turned toward him. It was a subtle distinction. But it mattered. If the enemy was simply concealed, there would be inconsistencies, small deviations, detectable patterns, something that could be isolated and analyzed. But if the enemy was integrated into the environment so completely that it became indistinguishable from it, then there was nothing to detect. Only absence where something should have been. Velaroth looked at the display again. "We are not fighting a fleet," he said. "We are inside a system." The realization did not bring clarity. It brought weight. Because a system could not be outmaneuvered the way a fleet could. A system did not expose itself. A system waited. Far from the command room, deep within the data archives of the flagship, someone else was coming to a similar conclusion. Zelmaru had not been assigned to this problem. No one had asked for his input. But he had access to the communication networks of Earth, and unlike most of the fleet, he was actually reading them. Not the summaries. Not the extracted keywords. The raw data. He sat alone, surrounded by streams of human information. History, broadcasts, records stretching back centuries. At first, it had been overwhelming. There was too much. Too many voices, too many perspectives, too much contradiction. But patterns began to emerge. Not in what the humans said. In how they responded to things. Crisis. Conflict. Disaster. He searched for the expected trajectory, a gradual move toward stability, toward reduced conflict as technology advanced. He did not find it. What he found instead was repetition. Conflict followed by adaptation. Failure followed by analysis. Loss followed by preparation. Over and over. Different contexts. Same pattern. They did not avoid catastrophe. They learned from it. Every major event, wars, plagues, environmental collapse, left behind something new. Systems. Protocols. Institutions designed to prevent the same mistake from happening again. They documented everything. Not just victories. Mistakes. Zelmaru paused on a cluster of records labeled from roughly 400 years earlier. The language shifted there. Subtle at first. Then clear. References to an incident. Not widely publicized. Partially restricted. A non-human object entering the system. And not leaving. He leaned closer, pulling together fragments from different sources, reconstructing what he could from incomplete data. A ship had come. It had been destroyed. And after that, everything changed. Funding patterns. Research priorities. The language of certain classified programs. He found repeated references to readiness. Preparation for future contact. Preparation for something specific. Zelmaru sat back slowly. His hands were not entirely steady. This was not a civilization reacting in real time. This was a civilization that had already reacted. Long ago. He began compiling his findings, pulling together the threads into something coherent, something that could be presented. Not speculation. Pattern. Evidence. When he finished, he read through it once. Then again. Then he stood. This was not his place. He was not senior enough to walk into a command briefing uninvited. But the fleet was operating on assumptions that were no longer valid. And if those assumptions were wrong, everything built on them would fail. He made his way through the corridors of the flagship, past officers who barely noticed him, toward the command room where decisions were being made. Inside, Velaroth stood at the center of the shifting data, watching a system that refused to behave. Zelmaru stepped forward when the moment allowed. "Grand Admiral," he said. The interruption drew attention immediately. Velaroth turned slightly, his expression neutral, expectant. Zelmaru held out the compiled report. "I believe we have misunderstood the situation." The room went quiet. Velaroth took the document and began to read. Time passed. No one spoke. When he finished, he did not look up immediately. "You believe this is accurate?" he asked. Zelmaru chose his words carefully. "I believe it is incomplete," he said. "But consistent." Velaroth looked at him now. "Explain." Zelmaru took a breath. "They have known about us," he said. "Not specifically this fleet. But something like us. For centuries." A slight shift moved through the room. "They have a record of prior contact. Limited but enough to identify a pattern. Enough to understand what we represent." Velaroth said nothing. "They do not respond to threats the way other species do," Zelmaru continued. "They do not panic. They do not negotiate from fear." He hesitated only briefly. "They prepare." The same word Velaroth had used earlier. Now reinforced. Expanded. "They have had 400 years to study the idea of an encounter like this," Zelmaru said. 400 years to build systems, strategies, responses. He gestured slightly toward the display. "What we are experiencing is not their reaction." The pause. "It is their plan." Silence settled across the command room. Not the absence of sound. The absence of certainty. Velaroth turned back toward the tactical display. 300 ships. Fully armed. Fully capable. And positioned inside something they did not understand. "They have been watching us since we arrived," Zelmaru added quietly. "Every movement. Every deployment. They have more information about us than we have about them." That landed harder than anything else. Because it meant the imbalance was not just technological. It was informational. And that kind of imbalance was far more dangerous. Velaroth stood very still. For the first time in a very long career, there was no immediate decision waiting at the end of his analysis. Only a realization. He was not controlling this situation. He had entered it. And whatever came next would not follow the patterns he had relied on for 11,000 years. Outside the hull of the flagship, the stars remained unchanged. Cold. Distant. Silent. Inside the solar system, nothing moved that could be seen. And everything that mattered was already in motion. The order went out at a time when most of Earth was asleep. There was no announcement. No escalation in tone. No visible shift that anyone outside a handful of secured channels would have noticed. Grace Tillman checked the final readiness reports one last time. Every platform was in position. Every vessel was accounted for. Every variable that could be measured had been measured. There was nothing left to prepare. She opened a channel. "Execute Phase 2, she said. No emphasis. No pause. Just a statement. One by one, confirmations came back. 12 in total. Then the line went quiet. Out in the darkness beyond the outer planets, 12 human vessels changed state. It was not dramatic. No explosion of light. No sudden burst of energy. They simply stopped hiding. Their hulls shifted from perfect invisibility to something sensors could finally register. Heat signatures rose from nothing to measurable levels. Drive systems came online, steady and controlled. For the first time since the Veltari fleet had entered the system, there was something to see. 12 ships. Small compared to the Dominion's warships. Positioned far apart. Surrounding the fleet. Not close enough to threaten directly. Close enough to matter. On the Veltari flagship, alerts triggered instantly. Contact. An officer called out. Multiple vessels, 12 confirmed, bearing across all vectors. The tactical display updated in real time. Red markers appeared one by one, forming a wide sphere around the fleet. Not a formation. An enclosure. Velaroth's eyes moved across the display, tracking positions, distances, trajectories. They were there the entire time, someone said quietly. Yes, Velaroth replied. There was no surprise in his voice now. Only confirmation. Before any orders were given, a transmission came through. It did not originate from a single ship. It came from all 12 simultaneously. Same signal. Same timing. Same message. It was translated instantly. Direct. You have 72 hours to leave this system. A brief pause. After that, we stopped being polite. Silence followed. For seconds. Then the Veltari fleet opened fire. 300 warships unleashed a coordinated barrage across 12 separate targets. Energy output spiked to levels that would have overwhelmed most defensive systems instantly. The space where the human ships had been filled with light. And then it cleared. Nothing had been hit. The 12 ships were already moving. Not in straight lines. Not in predictable arcs. They shifted direction constantly, accelerating, decelerating, altering vectors in patterns that resisted every attempt to track them. Targeting systems locked, adjusted, predicted, and failed. Over and over. The Veltari weapons continued firing, recalibrating between volleys, feeding new data into their models. It did not help. The human ships were not reacting. They were operating on something already decided. Minutes passed. Then more. The firing continued. No hits. Not one. On the flagship, tension built, not through noise, but through repetition. Attempt. Failure. Adjustment. Failure again. Velaroth watched the data streams, his expression unchanged. They are not evading, he said. An officer turned toward him. Grand Admiral? They are executing a model, Velaroth continued. One designed specifically for our systems. That realization landed with precision. This was not improvisation. This was preparation meeting execution. After 6 minutes, the Veltari fleet ceased fire, not by order, but by diminishing effectiveness. Energy reserves remained high, weapons fully operational. But there was no target they could reliably hit. And continuing to fire without effect served no purpose. That was when the human ships changed behavior. They stopped running. Not completely, but enough. Their movement slowed, stabilized just enough for them to act. They moved inward. Not aggressively. Deliberately. They passed through the outer edges of the Veltari formation, maintaining distance, choosing paths that avoided direct confrontation. Then they began to fire. Not at hulls. Not at weapons. At systems. A communications array on one ship went dark in a precise, controlled burst. A propulsion unit on another failed, its output dropping instantly to 0. Sensor clusters flickered out across multiple vessels, one after another, each loss clean, contained, targeted. The attacks were not random. They were selective. Intentional. Every shot removed a capability. Not a ship. Within an hour, coordination began to break. Signals that had once flowed seamlessly between vessels became fragmented, delayed, incomplete. Ships that had operated as part of a unified whole began to function in isolation. Within 3 hours, large sections of the fleet were effectively blind to anything beyond their immediate range. Targeting systems relied on outdated information, firing at positions where the human ships had been, not where they were. Within 5 hours, the formation itself had lost coherence. 300 warships still existed. Still armed. Still dangerous. But no longer synchronized. No longer in control. In Montana, Grace watched the shift unfold across the display. Communications degradation at 32%, a technician reported. 40, another added moments later. Lou Farrant spoke without looking up. Platforms holding. Grace nodded. Maintain sequence. Out in the system, the hidden platforms adjusted. For the first time, they fired in a way the Veltari could register. Not direct hits. Near misses. Impacts calculated to pass close enough to register clearly on damaged sensors. Close enough to demonstrate precision. Far enough to avoid destruction. One strike passed within kilometers of a Veltari cruiser, the shockwave rippling across its hull, lighting up every remaining sensor. Another followed from a completely different direction. Then another. Different vectors. Same message. We can reach you. We are choosing not to. On the flagship, the effect was immediate. Velaroth watched the data come in, fragmented, incomplete, but sufficient. The pattern was clear. This was not an attack. It was a demonstration. A boundary. He made his decision. Full stop, he said. The order moved through the fleet as far as it could go, transmitted across damaged communication lines, repeated by ships that could still relay it. Gradually, the movement ceased. Weapons powered down. Engines idled. 300 warships came to a halt. Not repositioning. Not regrouping. Stopping. Minutes passed. No further strikes followed. The 12 human ships held their positions at a distance. Unmoving. Watching. In the quiet that followed, Velaroth looked at the display, at what remained of his fleet's coordination, at the gaps in their awareness, at the system that surrounded them without ever fully appearing. For the first time, the situation was completely clear. They could continue. They could escalate. They could attempt to fight an enemy they could not see, could not predict, and could not reliably strike. Or they could recognize what had already been demonstrated. This was not a battle they were going to win. Not here. Not like this. He opened a channel. All vessels, he said. His voice was steady. Hold position. Do not engage. Across the fleet, the order spread. And for the first time since entering the system, the Veltari Dominion was not advancing. It was waiting. Not by choice. But because it had been given no other option. The negotiation began without ceremony. There were no grand halls, no symbolic gestures, no attempt to frame the moment as anything larger than what it was. A problem. And two sides deciding how to resolve it. The meeting space had been prepared years in advance for a moment like this. A stripped-down shuttle bay aboard the EDS Iron Wall, cleared of unnecessary equipment, arranged with practical precision. A table. Chairs on one side. A standing platform on the other. The air composition had been adjusted carefully. Temperature stabilized. Lighting balanced to avoid discomfort for either species. Nothing about the room was accidental. Everything about it was unremarkable. That was intentional. On the human side, 3 people entered first. Grace Tillman took her seat without hesitation, her posture relaxed but attentive, the kind of stillness that came from knowing exactly what she represented. Cal Donahue stood for a moment before sitting, his movements unhurried, his expression unchanged from the one he had worn throughout the entire encounter. Between them, Ruth Calder adjusted her glasses slightly and placed a thin folder on the table in front of her. She did not open it yet. She looked at the empty platform across from them and waited. The Veltari arrived seconds later. Velaroth stepped into the room with 2 advisors at his side. Behind them, slightly apart, stood Zelmer. He carried nothing. But he watched everything. There was no greeting beyond acknowledgement. No attempt at establishing dominance through posture or positioning. Both sides already understood the situation too clearly for that. They took their places. And for a moment, no one spoke. Then Ruth Calder began. Let's establish how we're going to have this conversation, she said. Her voice was calm. Even. Not loud, but impossible to ignore. We'll keep it direct. We'll keep it precise. And we'll avoid wasting time on statements that don't change outcomes. She folded her hands lightly on the table. If that works for you, we can proceed. Velaroth studied her for a moment, then gave a slight nod. It began there. The first day was structure, boundaries, communication protocols, clarifications of meaning, not because either side lacked understanding, but because precision mattered. Every word would carry weight. Every definition would shape what followed. Ruth set the pace. Not fast, not slow, consistent, impossible to rush, impossible to stall. Velaroth spent most of that first day watching her. He had dealt with negotiators before. They always revealed something. A priority, a fear, a need. It was how leverage worked. Find the point of pressure. Apply it. He watched her carefully. He found nothing. No urgency. No visible stake. No sign that she needed this to go a certain way. That was unusual. On the second day, he asked directly, "What does your species want from this negotiation?" Ruth adjusted her glasses slightly. She did not answer immediately. Not because she needed time. Because she chose not to rush. "We want the situation to stabilize," she said. Velaroth waited. "That includes 3 things," she continued. "You stop expanding into this region. You withdraw from this system. And we begin a structured discussion about the civilizations currently under your control." One of Velaroth's advisors shifted slightly. "That is a limited demand," Velaroth said. "It is a sufficient one," Ruth replied. "You could ask for more," he said. "Technology, territory, strategic access." "We could," Ruth agreed. "Why don't you?" She considered the question. Not for effect. For accuracy. "Because we don't need those things," she said. The answer settled into the space between them. Not defensive. Not aggressive. Simply stated. Velaroth watched her closely. "Every species we have encountered has claimed similar intentions at some stage," he said. "Stability. Limited objectives." "And what happened after?" Ruth asked. He did not answer. "They were negotiating from fear," she continued. "That changes how people speak. It changes what they promise." She leaned back slightly. "We are not afraid of you." There was no emphasis in the statement. No challenge. Just fact. That changes what our words mean. Zelmaru, standing behind the Veltari delegation, made a quiet note. Not performance. Not posturing. Alignment. The conversation continued. Day after day. Details replaced generalities. Specifics replaced assumptions. There were disagreements. Points of resistance. Moments where Veltari advisors pushed back, testing limits, probing for weaknesses. Each time, Ruth responded the same way. Calmly. Precisely. Without shifting her position unless there was a reason to. Grace spoke when necessary. Not often. But when she did, it was to introduce information that reframed the discussion in ways that were difficult to ignore. Cal spoke rarely, but his presence carried its own weight. When he did speak, it was to confirm capability. Not threaten. Not exaggerate. Just clarify. On the 6th day, the conversation narrowed. 17 civilizations. That was where the resistance concentrated. The internal structure of the Dominion is not subject to external negotiation, one of Velaroth's advisors said. Ruth nodded slightly. "We're going to discuss it anyway," she replied. The tone did not change. "That isn't optional," she added. "The only question is whether you participate in shaping the outcome." Silence followed. Not immediate agreement, but recognition. Over the next 3 days, that point was worked through piece by piece. Frameworks. Oversight. Processes that allowed for change without immediate collapse. It was not ideal. Not clean. Not perfect. But it was real. And it held. On the final day, the agreement was assembled in full. The Dominion would cease expansion into this region. The fleet would withdraw. A structured review process would begin for the civilizations under Dominion control. Not freedom. Not immediately. But a path. Defined. Enforceable. Observed. It was more than had ever existed before. Velaroth reviewed the terms in silence. Then he looked up. "I have a question," he said. Ruth waited. "At the beginning," he continued, "when we first arrived, the message your officer sent. The one telling us to leave." A brief pause. Did he know this would be the outcome? Ruth considered that. Then she gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "You should ask him," she said. Later, after the agreement was finalized, Velaroth did. The message was simple. Direct. "Did you know you would win?" Cal Donahue read it alone. He held his coffee in both hands, looking at the words for a long moment before responding. Then he typed. "We don't think in terms of winning." The pause. "We think about what comes next." He sent it. And that was the end of it. The next morning, the Veltari fleet turned. Slowly. 300 ships shifting direction in coordinated silence, their massive hulls rotating away from the small blue planet they had come to claim. Engines ignited. Not in attack. In departure. From Earth, nothing could be seen. No light show. No visible confirmation. But out in the system, the distance between the fleet and the planet began to grow. Grace Tillman watched it happen from her station. No one spoke. There was nothing to add. Beside her, Lou Farrant was already making notes. "Zone 3 still needs recalibration," he said. Grace nodded faintly. "I know." On the display, the Veltari ships grew smaller. Dimmer. One by one, they slipped further into the dark. Behind them, the system returned to stillness. The platforms went quiet. The ships disappeared back into silence. Everything returned to where it had been. Waiting. Working. Preparing. Because that was what it had always been. Not a moment. Not a victory. The process. One problem at a time. One system at a time. Always moving forward. Always ready for what came next. The system did not celebrate. There were no broadcasts declaring victory, no sudden release of tension across the networks that had quietly carried the weight of the past days. Most people on Earth never saw the details of what had happened. They would hear about it later in careful summaries, in controlled language that explained without exposing. Up close, it had never looked like a war. It had looked like work. Grace Tillman stayed at her station long after the last Veltari ship had slipped beyond the edge of the system. The display in front of her had already begun to simplify, threat markers removed, overlays cleared, returning piece by piece to the quiet map it had been before the fleet arrived. 300 ships had come. 300 ships had left. The space between those two facts was filled with years no one outside a small circle would ever fully understand. Behind her, the room had thinned. Technicians rotated out in shifts, voices lowered, movements slower now that urgency had given way to routine. The systems were still running, still tracking, still verifying that nothing unexpected remained. There was always that possibility. There was always the next thing. Lou Farrant was still there. He had not moved much in the last hour, eyes fixed on a column of diagnostics that continued to scroll steadily downward. Zone 3 calibration is off by 0.02, he said, as if finishing a conversation that had never paused. Grace didn't turn. "Fix it." "I will." A few seconds passed. "We can improve the response time by about 6% if we rework the targeting loop." "Do it." He nodded once, already moving on to the next adjustment. That was how it worked. There was no finish line. Only refinement. Grace finally leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes for a moment. Not long enough to rest. Just long enough to let the tension that had been held in place settle into something manageable. 400 years. She thought about that number the way she always did, not as history, but as continuity. People who had started something they would never see completed. People who had built systems without knowing if they would ever be used. People who had passed knowledge forward with the quiet assumption that someone else would need it. They had been right. A soft tone pulled her attention back to the console. Incoming report. Outer system sensors. Routine sweep. She opened it. Nothing unusual. Of course. That was the point. On the far side of the system, where the Veltari fleet had vanished into deep space, there was no sign they had ever been there. No debris. No residual signal. No trace that 300 warships had once filled that region with power and intent. Only distance. And silence. On the EDS iron wall, Cal Donahue sat alone in the dim light of the command deck. The screens around him had shifted to low-activity mode, data streams reduced to slow, steady updates. He held a fresh cup of coffee, letting it cool while he looked at nothing in particular. The message he had sent at the beginning replayed in his mind. Not the words, but the moment. Turn around and leave. Simple. Accurate. At the time, it hadn't felt like confidence. It had felt like procedure. You respond to what arrives. You apply what you've prepared. You move forward. That was all it had ever been. A quiet chime indicated an incoming internal message. He glanced at it. Status updates. System checks. Standard post-engagement reports. Everything was normal. He set the cup down and leaned back slightly, the weight of the past days settling into the background where it belonged. There would be more work. There was always more work. In a small compartment aboard the departing flagship, Zelmaru was still writing. He had not stopped since the fleet had turned. Page after page filled with observations, interpretations, records of what had happened and what it meant. Not for immediate use. For later. For understanding. He paused only once, looking back at a single line he had written earlier. They did not react. They executed. He considered it. Then added another. They were not surprised by us. They had been waiting. He sat back slightly, reading through the accumulated pages. The Dominion had encountered resistance before. But not like this. Not a force that did not seek expansion. Not a species that did not measure success in territory or dominance. Something else. Something that treated conflict as a problem to be solved, not an opportunity to exploit. He closed the document. Not finished. But complete enough for now. Outside, the fleet continued its steady movement into deep space, engines humming with the same consistency they always had. But the direction had changed. Back in the solar system, the last of the hidden platforms settled into their default states. Heat signatures dropped to nothing. Active systems powered down to minimal levels. From any external scan, they were once again indistinguishable from the cold debris that surrounded them. The 12 fast attack vessels faded the same way they had appeared, quietly, completely, leaving no trace of where they had been. The system returned to what it had always been. Still, quiet, ordinary. Except it wasn't. Because now, somewhere beyond the edge of known space, a record existed. A record of a fleet that had arrived with certainty. And left with understanding. Grace opened one final channel before leaving her station. Stand down to passive monitoring, she said. Acknowledgements came back. Systems shifted. The work continued. Outside, the stars remained unchanged. Cold. Distant. Silent. And somewhere in that silence, something else would eventually move. It always did. When it did, the system would still be here. Waiting. Prepared. Ready to do what it had learned to do a very long time ago. Handle what comes next. There was no moment when Earth returned to normal. Normal had never been the right word for it. The world simply continued. Cities kept moving. Ships kept crossing oceans. Satellites kept orbiting. News cycles shifted as they always did, from urgency to interpretation, from uncertainty to controlled understanding. Most people were told very little. What they were told was enough. A fleet had arrived. A fleet had left. Contact had been managed. The rest stayed behind layers of classification, systems of compartmentalization designed less to hide the truth than to prevent it from overwhelming the people who did not need to carry it. In the weeks that followed, life reorganized itself in subtle ways. Not dramatically. Just enough to reflect what had been learned. In underground facilities and quiet offices across multiple continents, work continued without interruption. The pace did not slow. If anything, it became more focused. Because the encounter had confirmed something that had long been suspected but never fully proven. They were not alone. And they were not done being visited. Grace Tillman stood once more in the operations center in Montana, but the room felt different now. Less like a command hub under pressure. More like the center of a system that had expanded its own definition of responsibility. The main display had been reduced to background monitoring. No threat overlays. No active engagement tracking. Just the solar system, rendered in clean, stable lines as if nothing had ever disturbed it. Lou Farrant was reviewing recalibration reports again. He always was. Zone 3 is holding better now, he said without looking up. Define better, Grace replied. Error margin down to 0.014. Acceptable. He paused. It could still be improved. A faint exhale from Grace, almost a laugh but not quite. It always can. That was the pattern. Not resolution. Refinement. Across the network, other teams were doing the same thing. Updating models. Adjusting assumptions. Revising contingency frameworks that had now been stress-tested in ways no simulation had ever managed to replicate. There was no victory state in any of it. Only continuity. On Earth, the public narrative had settled into something stable. Not comforting but contained. Most people understood one simple idea. Something had come. It had been handled. And it could come again. What mattered was that the response existed now. Not theoretical. Not planned. Proven. That knowledge changed behavior in small, almost invisible ways. Long-term infrastructure projects received more consistent funding. Scientific coordination between previously separate agencies increased. Deep space observation programs expanded quietly, without announcement or fanfare. Nothing rushed. Everything steady. As if the world had collectively agreed, without ever stating it aloud, that attention was now part of survival. Far beyond Earth, at the edge of the system, the last residual traces of the encounter continued to fade. Not physically, but operationally. Signal patterns normalized. Anomalies flattened into background noise. Even the memory of disruption began to dissolve into statistical history. What remained was structure. Hidden systems. Dormant platforms. Ships that no longer needed to move. They were not active. But they were not gone. They were waiting in the same way they had always been waiting. Not for conflict. For verification. For the next time something arrived that did not belong. And in deep space, far beyond any current scan range, the Veltari fleet continued its return. 300 ships moving through darkness that no longer felt unfamiliar to them. Inside those vessels, the experience had settled into reflection. Not fear. Not denial. Something closer to recalibration. They had arrived with certainty. They were leaving with understanding that certainty had limits. In the observation chamber of the flagship, Velaroth stood alone for a long time. The fleet no longer required his constant input. Orders were stable. Course corrections automated. The Dominion would continue moving without his immediate oversight. That was always the goal. Efficiency. Continuity. Control. But something had changed in how those words felt. Behind him, the vastness of space stretched without end. Ahead, the direction of return was already set. He thought about the system they had left behind. Not as a conquered space. Not as a failed acquisition. But as something else. A place that had not reacted the way it should have. A place that had already prepared for their arrival long before they had arrived. A place that did not behave like prey. Or even like resistance. Something closer to a mirror. Showing back exactly what had been brought to it. And something more. Showing what had been built in response. He did not speak the thought aloud. There was no one left in the room to hear it. Zelmaru, elsewhere on the ship, continued his record until the end of the journey segment. His final entry was not dramatic. It was observational. They do not see themselves as having won. They see themselves as having maintained readiness. He paused before adding one final line. That may be the most dangerous kind of victory. He saved the file. And closed it.